this is the story that I want to relate to you this morning, and as I say, apply it to in a certain way, but also you will be able to apply it in ways to yourself as well. It's a very well-known story, at least I think it is. But just to remind you, we've got a little video about it just in a moment or two. The title of the sermon this morning is a really very encouraging one for the beginning of a new year. It's what to do when things change and then get even worse. So I've got really good news for you this morning, and the story does have a better ending, so don't lose hope at the beginning. But just to put this into context where we're at the moment, it's a story about David and the army that he gets together. But David, up to this point, he's really only known success after success. You'll remember as a child, really looking after the sheep, he fought with a lion and he fought with a bear. And those were the kind of credentials he told to King Saul when he went out to see his brothers at the front line, seeing them fighting Goliath. And all the soldiers, the seasoned soldiers, were all running away scared from this giant Goliath. But David, who knew his God, said, "Why are you all running away? I'll go." And you know the story, very famous story. He just takes 5 stones from the brook. He's got his sling, and that was all he needed, was one shot with that sling, and all he needed was that and his reliance on God. And the Goliath, I'm being fast announced.
Oh, just keep going.
Oh. Okay. Nobody noticed. She put me off now. Okay, so David had fought with Goliath, and you know the story. He defeats the Philistines. He was a songwriter. He wrote lots and lots of songs. We call them the Psalms. He didn't write all the Psalms that we've got, but he wrote a great majority of them. He was a skilled musician, and in the early days, Saul used to ask for him to come and play specifically for him. But everything changed when the people started singing the song of their own. And they started saying this, they started singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And that made Saul jealous, and he took a dislike to David after that. And so David had to run for his life, and he went on the run. But as he went on the run, he gathered an army of misfits, all the people that had got some kind of thing against the king, or they were in debt, or whatever it was, but it was an army of misfits that he gathered together. And it seems like there were 600 of them. And at this point in David's life, he'd actually allied himself, believe it or not, with the Philistines. And he'd been fighting with the Philistines and helping them fight their battles. And he'd been doing this for at least 12 months, where we pick up the story. So I'm just going to play this little video. Hopefully you can hear it. Linda will tell me if you can't, but hopefully you'll hear the narration as well.
David leaves the Philistines. 1 Samuel 29 and 30. For more than a year, David and his followers had lived among the Philistines. David had moved there to get away from Saul. He was sure that Saul would kill him if he kept roaming through Israel. Now the Philistines were ready to attack Israel. David and his soldiers went with the Philistine army, marching at the end of the line along with the Philistine king. The Philistine commanders were not pleased. They thought David and his men might turn against them in the battle and fight for Israel. So they asked their king to send David and his men home. King Achish did not want to do this, but he told David that the commanders did not want him to stay. David and his men had been living in the village of Ziklag. When they went back to their homes, they found that some Amalekites had been there. These people were enemies of David's people, the Israelites, just as the Philistines were. David, his men, and their families had been safe with the Philistines, but the Amalekites burned the city of Ziklag and took all the wives and children. David and his men cried for a long time. Then they asked the Lord if they should go after the Amalekites. The Lord told them to go. Along the way, 200 of the men became so tired they couldn't go on, but the other 400 kept on going with David. Before long, they found a young Egyptian boy. His Amalekite master had left him behind because he was sick. The boy led David and his men to the Amalekite camp. They defeated the Amalekites and rescued their families, getting back all of the loot the Amalekites had taken. When everyone got back to the place where the 200 had stopped, the 400 soldiers who had done the fighting did not want to share the loot. But David made a new rule. All the soldiers were to share with each other. Even the 200 who had stayed back to watch the tools and supplies would get their share. After David got back to Ziklag, he shared some more of the loot. He shared it with the leaders of several cities that he and his men had visited.
Again, the title of what we're talking about this morning is what to do when things change and then get even worse. So this is the story that we're following through. The Philistines had gathered their forces at Alphek, and David and his men were marching at the rear with Ashish. So it started out just like any other day. They were just lining themselves up, ready for another battle. But things change very quickly. And this one was different. This battle was a different battle, because they were actually going to be fighting Israel. And this is what they said. It says, the commanders of the Philistines asked, what about these Hebrews, meaning the army that David had got? Ashish replied, Is this not David who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, and I've found no fault in him. But the commanders were angry and said, send the man back, that he may return to the place assigned to him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favour than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So things were working well up until this point. The previous affiliations that David had made, the friendships and the connections that he'd made, he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with some of these people fighting, and but through no fault of his own, he'd done everything that he had been asked to do. But this alliance was now broken, and he was told to go home, take all his men and go back home. So during this year that we've had, this COVID year, things have suddenly changed for many thousands of people. One day they had a job, and the next day they've either been furloughed or they've been made redundant, and suddenly their livelihood has been taken away from them. And again, through no fault of their own, it's just because of the event that has suddenly happened. That's how I'm applying it at the moment, but as I say, you can apply it maybe in your own situation where something has happened and it's suddenly changed your situation. So the men started their 3-day march home. To start with, they were disappointed and they were angry and they were confused. Why couldn't they fight anymore? What is it they'd done wrong? They couldn't think of any reason, and so they did get angry and they did get confused, and that's often the way it can be for you when things change and you don't understand what's going on. You can get disappointed, you can get angry, you can be confused, and you can get angry and disappointed with God even. But it was, as I say, it was a 3-day journey home. So maybe for the first couple of days they were just trying to get to grips with what had happened, and but they're getting nearer home now, so the spirit starts to lift. Well, at least we're nearly home. At least we're going to see the family again. At least we're going to have some home cooked food. That's going to be much better than what we've been living on at the battlefront. So though they were disappointed, but they started to get more hopeful. And this is kind of what happens, isn't it? You get a shock and something changes and you don't know what's happening, but you kind of try to rally yourself and you try to think of positive things and get a little bit more hopeful for the future. But this wasn't to be the case for David and the army. It was a disaster. They came to their homes and they saw them all burnt to the ground. Everything was gone. Everyone was taken captive, and all their livestock had gone as well. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine that, really. And I hope none of us ever have to go through anything like this. But they were even more dazed and even more bewildered, wondering what on earth was going on. But David, despite losing everything himself and then being threatened by his own men to stone him, David did the only thing that he knew what to do, and that was to find, it says he encouraged himself in the Lord. David found strength in the Lord. So there's 600 men here, all getting from their bewilderment and their not knowing what's going on, they start to get angry and they look for something or someone to blame, don't they? And it's very easy to go from being the hero to being the leader who is despised and not liked at all. And this is what happened for David. One minute he's their leader and telling them, this is what we've got to do. And they're kind of looking up to him. But then now they're looking for someone to blame for this disaster. And they turn their anger and their bitterness and their discouragement onto David. But David somehow, I don't know what he said to them or how he persuaded them that, no, look, we've got to encourage ourselves in God. But this is what David did. Do you know how to do that, is my question. Do you know how to do what David did when everything went wrong? Do you know how to encourage yourself in the Lord? Do you know how to dig deep into the promises of God and apply them to your own situation when things go from bad to worse? Because this is what we're going to need to be able to know how to do. I don't want to be a prophet of doom or anything, but I think this is just the beginning that we're seeing at the moment. I don't think it's going to get better. If anything, it's going to get worse. But we need to be prepared. We need to be ready. And this is one of the things we need to know how to do. We need to know how to encourage ourselves in the Lord. We need to know how to dig deep into the Word of God and to gain encouragement. And David did it for himself, but he also managed to encourage his army around him and change them from wanting to stone him to again wanting to follow him. What did he do? He encouraged himself in God. He reminded himself who God was. He reminded himself of all the victories that he'd had before. But he also did this. He inquired of the Lord. He asked for the priest to come, and he asked him this. He said, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" So he asks questions, and I call these binary questions. They're yes-no questions. Shall I pursue the raiding army? It's just a yes or a no, isn't it? Will I overtake them? Yes, you will. No, you won't. And this is a good way to inquire of God. It's just to ask a simple question. Shall I do A or shall I do B? And if you really, really trust what God says to you, then that's the faith that you've got to use, is to obey what he says. So on this occasion, he says, yes, pursue them. That's the answer. And he says, yes, you will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. So somehow David encourages himself. He gets this answer, and it's a public answer to the whole of the army, and they rally around him again, and off they go, pursuing the Amalekites who had raided their town and took everything away. But on the way, David's army is reduced to only 400. 200 of them were just simply too exhausted in order to carry on. So you might start out with a big number, but along the way you may lose some who just have not got any energy left. So they left the 200 behind, looking after some of the supplies, and the 400 carried on. They discovered where the enemy was, and they gained that information from a sick slave that they found in a field, an Egyptian, who was with the Amalekites. And they discovered where they were going, they discovered who else they'd raided, and so they knew where to go. Once you start out following the word of God, then you will get pointers in the right direction along the way. But you have to have faith and to start out on the journey, and you have to believe what God has told you. So he led David down to where they were, scattered all over the countryside. Now the army had started eating, drinking and reveling. They got drunk because of the great amount of plunder they'd taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. And it says David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except for 400 young men who rode off in camels and fled. David, listen to this, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else that they had taken. And David came back with everything. So what looked to be a disappointment in not being allowed to fight with the Philistines, what looked to be a massive disaster with their houses all burnt down and their families taken away, has now been recovered. David brought everything back. But he didn't just bring that back. He brought all the rest of the plunder back from the Amalekite army, from all the plunder that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Israel, from Judah. So when David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, here's a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. I want you to understand there must have been so much plunder here that David was not only able to give out to the 600 soldiers their share of the plunder, but he had so much left over that he was able to send other gifts from that plunder to all his to the elders who were his friends, the ones that had supported him, the ones that had helped him while he was on the run. He sent this this plunder to him. So this is just how I'm summing up the whole thing. It says from one disaster to another. You may go from one disaster to another disaster, and you might think your whole world and your whole life is just turned upside down. But the Lord's got everything in hand, and the Lord restores back far more than you've lost. It'll be enough for yourself and more. Enough for you to then bless others with too. So take courage. This year's been a difficult year. I'm telling you, I'm not too sure how much better it's going to get, but we need to be prepared and we need to be ready. We need to be able to do two things. We need to know how to encourage ourselves in God, and we need to know how to inquire of God, how to hear God, how to get his instructions, and then we need the faith to follow it through and to do what he tells us to do.